In the late 1890s, when photography was still a complex, demanding art reserved for the dedicated few, a small circle of gentlemen in New England gathered not merely to document life, but to challenge its very limits. They were the Atherton Society for the Advancement of the Visual Arts, an esoteric group who saw the camera not as a mirror, but as a portal. The image before us, a sepia-toned artifact of that era, shows the principal members. There was Arthur Penhaligon, the Society's visionary founder, standing on the far left, his face alight with a dangerous, almost feverish excitement. He was the one who insisted the camera could capture the space between moments. Then there was Thomas Albright, second from the left, the Society's financier. He provided the funds for their outlandish endeavors, but always wore the weary, skeptical expression of a man footing the bill for miracles he didn't quite believe in. And finally, Dr. Elias Thorne, third from the left, a chemist and the group's scientific mind, whose cold, meticulous gaze betrayed a desire to reduce the ethereal to an equation. These men shared a deep, unsettling conviction that the modern camera, with its faster lenses and improved chemistry, could momentarily freeze things too quick for the human eye, or even things that shouldn't have been there at all. They dismissed the landscape prints and polite portraits of the day, yearning instead for the impossible image. Their obsession culminated in Project Chronos. The name, derived from the Greek word for linear time, was fittingly ambitious. Penhaligon had fixated on the speed of the newly introduced express trains. To truly master the photographic arts, they had to capture the New York Central's 20th Century Limited in a perfect, still instant. It was a technical challenge worthy of their zeal. They just didn't realize they were preparing not for a photographic experiment, but for a temporal intrusion. The grand challenge was less about capturing motion, and more about capturing a moment that was utterly, devastatingly wrong. The pursuit of the impossible image was not cheap, nor was it simple. Project Chronos demanded custom equipment, the cost of which repeatedly tested Thomas Albright's patience and bank account. The focal point of the experiment was the camera itself, a large, heavy, box-like apparatus, a masterpiece of contemporary engineering. It utilized a lens specially ground in Germany for unprecedented speed, paired with a newly synthesized emulsion on the glass plate that promised to dramatically shorten the necessary exposure time. The men had spent weeks practicing, synchronizing their bulky shutter release mechanisms to a hair-trigger clockwork device. Their target was the New York Central's 20th Century Limited, a technological marvel that represented the apex of speed and power. They chose the local station platform for its ideal sightlines, despite the logistical nightmare of setting up their sensitive, fragile gear in the cold night air. The location was critical. The moment the train passed this exact point was scheduled with railway precision. They needed to capture it at the peak of its momentum. Dr. Elias Thorne meticulously calculated the necessary light. A powerful newly developed arc lamp, seen prominently in the photograph, was positioned to bathe the subject in brilliant, if somewhat harsh, illumination. The goal was to remove all variables, to ensure that if they failed, the fault lay not in their preparation, but in the limitations of physics itself. On the night in question, the air was thick with tension and the smell of ozone from the lamp. Every wire, every screw, every chemical measurement was triple-checked. They were not merely taking a picture, they were attempting an act of temporal burglary. As the scheduled time of the train's arrival approached, the men positioned themselves, silent and rigid, waiting for the whistle that would signal the start of their grand, terrifying experiment. The air was unnaturally still that night. The glow from the powerful arc lamp cast long, stark shadows, exaggerating the drama of the empty platform. The hour set for the express train's arrival was 10:47 p.m. The men of the Atherton Society stood rigid, their breath misting in the cool air, each man holding a cable release connected to their complex shutter mechanism. As the clock on the station house ticked past 10:46, they strained their ears for the familiar, echoing whistle, the signal that the great locomotive was approaching the bend. But the silence was absolute. Arthur Penhaligon, the visionary, nervously checked his pocket watch, his brow furrowed with confusion. Then, at precisely 10 hours 47 minutes and 3 seconds, it happened. Not the distant whistle, but a sudden, violent sensation. The air pressure dropped, then slammed back with a rush of wind so powerful it tugged at their coats. A deafening, metallic roar and a cloud of inexplicable steam enveloped the platform for a split second. Every man instinctively flinched, certain they had just been passed by the thunderous train. In that instant of chaos, Penhaligon shouted the command. Now! Now! 5 hands pressed 5 triggers. The custom-built shutter mechanism clicked with a sharp, synchronized thwack. Just as suddenly as it began, the sensory assault vanished. The air returned to stillness, the sound evaporated, and the platform was empty once more. The men stood staring at each other, adrenaline coursing through them. Thomas Albright, the skeptic, was pale. What was that?" he whispered. A moment later, the weary station master appeared from his office. "Everything all right, gentlemen? Bit of a cold night for your picture-taking, isn't it?" He confirmed the growing anxiety. The telegram had just arrived. The train was running nearly an hour behind schedule due to a major derailment upstate. Nothing had passed this platform at 10:47. But the men knew otherwise. They had felt it. And now, they had the photographic plate, the potential evidence of an event that, according to all physical records, had never happened. The air in the Atherton Society's darkroom was thick with the smell of developing chemicals and a palpable, nervous excitement. The men stood huddled under the dim, red safe light, watching as Dr. Elias Thorne meticulously worked the plate in the trays. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic sloshing of the developer. Initially, there was a gasp of triumph. The image emerged, dark lines slowly coalescing into a clear picture of the train, its powerful locomotive perfectly rendered. It was the epitome of photographic success, a fast-moving subject frozen in time. They had done it. Project Kronos was a triumph of technique. The scene captured on the plate is the very one we now see projected on the screen. The long, massive shape of the 20th Century Limited, blurred slightly by speed, but undeniably there. But as the jubilation faded, a profound disquiet took its place. Arthur Penhaligon stepped closer, holding a magnifying glass to the wet plate. "It's too perfect," he murmured. "If it was an echo, as we suspect, shouldn't there be some distortion, some lack of clarity?" The terrifying reality quickly set in. They had successfully photographed a train that, according to the station master's official ledger, was still 40 miles away, paralyzed by mechanical failure. Their triumph had immediately curdled into a mystery. How could a light-sensitive plate capture the image of an object that was not physically present? The laws of physics, the very foundation of their art, seemed to have been spectacularly violated. The men in the photograph are now gathered around the large projection, their faces reflecting the impossible scene. Their expressions are no longer those of enthusiastic inventors, but of men gazing upon a ghostly, irrefutable record of an event that existed outside of time. Their camera hadn't just captured a picture, it had captured a contradiction. The Atherton Society, initially eager to dismiss the sensory experience as mass hysteria and the photograph as a technical fluke, sought to solidify the official timeline. They returned to the station master, a dependable man named Mr. Abernathy, armed with their unsettling photograph. Mr. Abernathy was accustomed to the oddities of the local eccentrics, but the photograph silenced his jovial indifference. When Dr. Thorne presented the image, the perfect, phantom train, Abernathy's cheerful demeanor evaporated, replaced by a deep furrow of confusion. "Gentlemen, I can't account for this," he stammered, running a trembling hand over his meticulously kept logbook. He showed them the entry for the night, 10:45 p.m., wire received, NYC 20th Century Limited delayed. Engine failure near Albany. Estimated arrival 11:40 p.m. Abernathy was adamant. He swore on the Bible, on his years of service to the New York Central Line, that no engine, no carriage, no single puff of smoke had passed his post at 10:47 p.m. He'd been sitting at his desk, drinking tea and filling out his reports. He hadn't heard a thing until the Society's members had emerged, looking as though they'd seen a ghost. Thomas Albright, clutching the negative envelope tightly, pressed him. "Did you perhaps step out? Did a local freight pass without notice?" Abernathy shook his head firmly. Freight runs on the Eastern Line, Mr. Albright. And I saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. His testimony was the final, devastating piece of evidence. It eliminated mechanical error, human failure, and practical jokes. The station master's ledger, corroborated by his earnest, terrified face, confirmed the horrific truth. The light that struck their photographic plate had traveled from an object that, by every rational standard, was not physically present at that precise moment in space and time. The Atherton Society spent 2 frantic days trying to rationalize the impossible image. Was it a double exposure? A trick of light? A flaw in the expensive German lens? Every theory crumbled under Dr. Thorne's meticulous scrutiny. The photograph was sharp, cohesive, and perfectly centered on the track. It was, definitively, the train they had sought to capture. The final, chilling piece of the puzzle arrived in a terse telegram forwarded from the New York Central's Albany depot. It detailed the accident that had caused the express train's delay, a catastrophic mechanical failure that resulted in a derailment 40 miles up the line. The damage was extensive, and the news confirmed what they had feared: there had been a single, tragic fatality. The engineer of the 20th Century Limited, a veteran named Silas Kincaid, had been crushed in the wreckage. But it was the next line of the telegram, forwarded from the local sheriff, that stole the breath from Arthur Penhaligon's throat. Among the salvaged personal effects was Kincaid's pocket watch, recovered from his vest. It had been destroyed in the impact, the hands frozen precisely at the moment of the crash. The time displayed was 10:47 p.m. The Society's photograph had been taken at 10:47 p.m. The profound implications were instantly clear. Their camera hadn't simply captured an echo or a pre-image of a delayed train. It had recorded the exact moment of a man's death. They hadn't seen the train as it was or as it would be. They had somehow captured the dying imprint of the locomotive at the precise instant its engine driver's life had been extinguished 40 miles away. The light that struck their plate was the last, desperate flash of an ending. The experimental image had transformed from a photographic novelty into a memento mori, a horrifying record of a final, fatal moment. Of the 3 main members, only Dr. Elias Thorne, the scientist, retained his composure. Where Penhaligon descended into mystical terror and Albright into financial panic, Thorne saw a staggering, horrifying new set of variables. He believed that if an anomaly existed, it could be measured, catalogued, and potentially replicated. Thorne began working feverishly, locked away in the Society's library with scientific texts and philosophical treatises. He discarded conventional physics and turned to more esoteric, though rarely acknowledged, theories. His hypothesis centered on the concept of temporal resonance. He theorized that a catastrophic, high-energy event, like the violent destruction of a speeding locomotive, could create a momentary time stutter or echo. The camera, he proposed, with its perfectly timed high-speed shutter, had not taken a picture of the train present on the tracks, but had captured the light signature of the train in the moment of its fatal impact, 40 miles distant. It was a photographic recording of an energy surge that briefly bent spacetime. Thorne speculated that the massive, sudden release of kinetic energy, coupled with the immediate cessation of life, the engineer's death, somehow imprinted the train's image on the very fabric of the railway line itself. The Atherton camera, poised at the exact moment of the impact, was perfectly situated to capture this fading temporal scar. This chilling theory offered a rational, if revolutionary, explanation for the impossible image. It meant their camera was not a mere recorder of light, but a sophisticated, accidental instrument capable of detecting temporal bleed. This elevated their failure to a triumph, a frightening victory that carried the weight of a man's final moments. While Dr. Thorne retreated into the cold logic of physics, Arthur Penhaligon, the visionary, descended into a spiral of guilt and existential terror. For Penhaligon, the photograph was not a scientific breakthrough, it was a curse. He was convinced they had not merely photographed the train, but had somehow stolen a moment, the final, sacred moment, of Silas Kincaid's life. Penhaligon, whose initial enthusiasm had been fueled by a near-religious belief in the camera's power, was now haunted by his own ambition. He saw the train's ghostly image in every shadow, heard the phantom whistle in the silence of his study, and was certain that the dying engineer's spirit now lingered over the Atherton Society. The heavy, formal clothing he wore in the photograph suddenly felt like the black attire of mourners. He began spending hours gazing at the projection. He wasn't looking at the train, he was looking at the details that were missing. He became convinced that if he looked long enough, he would see the engineer's final, terrified glance through the cab window. He accused Thorne of being a ghoul for attempting to study the phenomenon, and he railed at Thomas Albright for focusing only on destroying the evidence. Penhaligon's emotional unraveling led him to a terrifying conclusion. The camera's power was uncontrollable, and they had unleashed something they could never put back. He grew pale, lost weight, and his hands began to tremble constantly. The man who had sought to capture the unseen was now overtaken by it, convinced that the camera and its impossible photograph were now drawing their own fatal moment closer. For Thomas Albright, the Society's financier, the impossible photograph represented something far more immediate and terrifying than temporal anomalies or spectral curses: catastrophic liability. Albright was a man of commerce and reputation, and the idea of his name being linked to a scientifically unfounded death prophecy was an absolute nightmare. While Penhaligon descended into mysticism and Thorne into relentless study, Albright focused ruthlessly on damage control. He immediately secured the original negative, the photographic plates, and the chemical notes, locking them away in a safe deposit box. He paid the stationmaster, Mr. Abernathy, a substantial sum to sign an affidavit stating the incident was a temporary visual hallucination caused by the arc lamp's unstable current. "We must destroy the print, dissolve the society, and forget Project Kronos ever existed," Albright insisted, his voice tight with desperation during a final, tense meeting. He saw the projected image not as a supernatural marvel, but as an object of scandal and ridicule that could ruin him. He was the pragmatic counterpoint to the group's madness. He didn't care how the photograph was taken, he only cared that its existence could compromise his position in society. His only concern was to maintain the facade of rational respectability. He attempted to buy the silence of the other members, offering them generous sums for their continued discretion. His retreat was not born of fear of the unknown, but fear of the known consequences, the ruin of his standing. In the end, Albright succeeded in suppressing the evidence, at least publicly. He ensured that the legend of the Atherton Society would become nothing more than a few local whispers, a cautionary tale about eccentric men and wasted money, effectively burying the deadly truth of the image for decades. The atmosphere within the Atherton Society quickly soured from intellectual excitement to toxic dread. The realization that they had somehow photographed the final breath of a stranger proved too heavy a burden for the small group to bear. Thomas Albright's frantic, practical efforts to suppress the negative only accelerated their dissolution. Within weeks of the fateful photograph, the society crumbled. Penhaligon, his mind clouded by morbid visions, publicly declared the camera a tool of the devil and disappeared from his wealthy family home, seeking refuge in a remote sanatorium where he could no longer see the blinding flash of the phantom train. He never spoke of photography again. Dr. Thorne, unable to convince his colleagues to continue the research and deprived of the original plate by Albright, saw his scientific curiosity wither into profound disappointment. He quietly returned to his laboratory work, dedicating the rest of his career to harmless, mundane chemical analysis, fearful of accidentally invoking another temporal rift. Most critically, the custom-built camera, the instrument of the impossible, vanished. Albright claimed it was destroyed, smashed to pieces and melted down. Yet, a persistent rumor suggested that Penhaligon, in his final manic episode, had hidden the device, believing it would only cease its unseen influence if removed entirely from human sight. The men scattered like seeds in the wind, leaving behind only the projected image, the terrifying ghost train, and the empty, velvet-draped room. The Atherton Society was formally dissolved, its brief, explosive existence filed away as a footnote in the history of local eccentrics. But the influence of the image lingered, an unshakable, unspoken fear that their camera had not only captured a moment, but had also marked them for a future anomaly. Following the quiet collapse of the Atherton Society, the official story, the one promoted by Thomas Albright, was simple. A few wealthy, eccentric men wasted money on a failed experiment. The custom camera was a dud, and the rumors of a ghost train were merely the result of a bad batch of chemicals and too much late-night whiskey. Publicly, the matter was closed. But secrets so potent rarely die. They merely seep into the soil. For decades, the story of the phantom photograph persisted in hushed tones around the railway lines and local pubs. It mutated, as all good legends do. Some said the camera was cursed. Others claimed the men were involved in dark spiritualism, trying to communicate with the dead engineer, Silas Kincaid. The photograph itself, the chilling, irrefutable image, was glimpsed only rarely, either in a dusty, forgotten trunk or whispered about by the descendants of the Atherton members. The legend became a classic local spook story, a tale told to new station employees on cold, foggy nights. "Watch the tracks at 10:47, they'd say, and you might just hear the train that's 40 miles away." This silence, the enforced lack of documentation, made the truth even more elusive. The official records were clean, but the folklore was infected with the reality of what happened. The town, having witnessed the sudden panicked disappearance of Penhaligon and the quiet retreat of Thorne, knew something genuinely terrifying had transpired. The absence of a rational explanation allowed the story to grow into something dark and potent, a historical certainty that had been deliberately buried by a man desperate to save his reputation. Decades later, the hushed secret of Project Kronos lay dormant, a cold case gathering dust. Then came Eleanor Penhaligon. A young historian specializing in fringe science and the uncanny, Eleanor was the great-granddaughter of Arthur Penhaligon. She didn't grow up hearing a romanticized tale of her ancestors' work. She was raised on the family myth of Arthur's shame and subsequent institutionalization. Intrigued by the whispers of a photographic catastrophe, she began tracing the family's abrupt move and the society's dissolution. Eleanor discovered a single, key piece of evidence hidden within an old family Bible, a frayed, hand-drawn map. It wasn't a map of a town or a treasure, but a highly technical diagram detailing the exact placement of the camera and the arc lamp on that fateful night. Beside it, in Arthur's panicked, frantic script, was a note: "The shadow remembers. Look for the metal that swallowed the light." Her research led her directly to the scattered records of the Atherton Society, where she quickly uncovered the conflicting official accounts and the terrifying correlation between the photograph's timestamp and the engineer's death. She realized her ancestor hadn't been mad, he had simply been exposed to a truth too large to bear. Eleanor's goal was not to resurrect the society, but to understand the physics of fear. She began by locating the descendants of Dr. Elias Thorne and Thomas Albright, hoping they might possess the missing negatives or the crucial scientific data. The past, she knew, was a heavy shroud, and she was determined to pull it back and finally confront the impossible image with modern eyes. Eleanor Penhaligon's investigation quickly zeroed in on the most crucial missing piece of the puzzle: the custom-built camera. As the instrument that had captured the fatal temporal anomaly, it was either the key to understanding Project Kronos or a dangerously cursed artifact, depending on one's viewpoint. Thomas Albright's descendants confirmed the family lore that the camera had been destroyed, smashed to pieces and tossed into the local foundry to be melted down. But Eleanor found this too neat, too final, for a man as paranoid and theatrical as her great-grandfather, Arthur. She trusted Arthur's frantic note: "The shadow remembers. Look for the metal that swallowed the light." Focusing on the phrase, "swallowed the light," Eleanor hypothesized that the visionary Arthur, in his madness, hadn't destroyed the device but had meticulously hidden the lens, the eye, that had seen the ghost train. Following the complex diagram from the family Bible, she realized Arthur hadn't drawn a map of the experiment site, but an intricate schematic of the camera's unique tripod mounting system. This led her to a forgotten, sealed-off attic storage room in the old Atherton clubhouse. There, hidden beneath decades of abandoned scientific clutter, she found not the full camera, but the tripod. And fused to the metal legs, preserved in a custom-made lead-lined box that shielded it from any ambient light, was the massive, German-ground lens. Holding the lens felt like holding a piece of frozen time. It was unnervingly cold and heavy. Eleanor realized that Arthur hadn't sought to protect the lens from damage, but from use. He believed the instrument, having seen death, retained a malignant charge, a power that could be reactivated. She had the camera's eye, but now she had to decide what to do with a piece of technology that might be inherently dangerous. Armed with the lens and her great-grandfather's notes, Eleanor Penhaligon drove to the location of Project Kronos. The old railway station was now a dilapidated, mostly forgotten freight depot, the express line having been moved years ago. Yet, the main platform, the exact spot where the Atherton Society had stood, remained, cracked and overgrown, but undeniably the same. Standing there at 10:47 p.m., the anniversary of the event, Eleanor felt a profound, chilling stillness. The air was cold, but not due to the weather. It was a deep, resonant coldness that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. She set up her own modern recording equipment, hoping to capture some measurable anomaly, a magnetic spike, an auditory echo, anything to validate Dr. Thorne's temporal resonance theory. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then, precisely at 10 hours 47 minutes and 3 seconds, Eleanor didn't hear a train, but she experienced a sudden, visceral, crushing sense of immense pressure. It was the distinct feeling of two massive objects colliding, a pressure so sharp it hurt her teeth and made her stomach drop. Her recording equipment registered a massive, instantaneous surge of electromagnetic energy, far exceeding any ambient reading. The sensation lasted only a second, then vanished, leaving Eleanor trembling, her ears ringing. She knew this was the phantom roar the Atherton men had felt. The ghost of the kinetic energy, the residue of the impact that had killed Silas Kincaid, still lingered on the platform, waiting for its appointed time. The place was marked, not by a physical scar, but by a temporal one. She had not seen a ghost, but she had experienced the ghost of a violent event, proving that the impossible image was not a lie or a fluke, but a chronic wound in the fabric of time. Eleanor Penhaligon stood on the darkened platform, the chilling electromagnetic ghost of the accident having faded, leaving her shaken but strangely exhilarated. She had found the truth that her great-grandfather, Arthur Penhaligon, had paid for with his sanity. The camera hadn't lied. The impossible image was devastatingly real. The photograph persists, a silent witness to a quantum oddity. It remains an unsettling artifact, challenging the very foundation of how we define reality. It is a perfect picture of a train that occupied the wrong coordinates in space at the wrong moment in time, a light signature belonging to a dying man 40 miles away. The theories remain locked in a perpetual struggle. Was Dr. Thorne's concept of temporal resonance correct, that massive energy events leave a measurable scar on time? Or was Arthur Penhaligon right in his paranoia, that the camera had accidentally touched a line between life and death, momentarily glimpsing the train through the eyes of the dying engineer, Silas Kincaid? Eleanor never tried to recreate Project Kronos. She preserved the German lens, placing it alongside the photograph and Arthur's notes, sealing the whole terrifying collection away from the world. She understood that some questions are best left unanswered, and some boundaries are best respected. The image of the train, clear and undeniable, stares out from the screen. It is a photograph of a ghost, a perfect moment stolen from a man's last second, forever questioning the reality we perceive. The Atherton Society sought to advance art, but they accidentally stumbled upon a truth that demanded a price far higher than the cost of their custom equipment, the price of knowing what happens when time itself fails.